Hello everybody, welcome to the Artisan Woodshed. My name is Barry. Well, it's not really a woodshed, it's actually a detached garage here at my house in Central Florida, but that's a different story altogether. It was the only name I could find. All right, so I happen to like it. So my wife and I happen to work with a lot of epoxy projects that include we try to find some unique woods and some unique designs and things like that to create a variety of boards. You know, you can see a lot of these here that are around me, some that are in work right now. This one right now has some blue deep pour epoxy down in it. And then I'm going to be covering that, or my wife's going to be covering that, with some clear epoxy to get a three-dimensional effect on that wood. And so today we're going to be talking about bubbles. And if you're curious what my wife primarily does for us here, is my wife is my finisher. If I'm using a top coat epoxy, then she's the person doing the seal coat and the flood coats and all of that. Probably deals with bubbles way more than this guy right here. But I learned and then I taught her. And she also deals with any type of finishing, whether it's Odie's oil, Rubio's monocoat, or anything else we may be trying or using at the same time. She does all of that, and she is outstanding at it. She has moved well beyond what I taught her and has now surpassed me. So, I happen to be on quite a few Facebook groups regarding resin/epoxy. And one of the things that I see recurringly on there is people talking about their challenges with bubbles in their projects. So I thought I would share my experiences, my thoughts on how do you deal with that, as you're evolving in your projects. First and foremost, if you're brand new to this, I strongly suggest you start out small. Do small things, get the process down, because there's so many steps along the way where things can potentially go wrong. It's better to learn those on small projects than jump right into a river table as an example. Because if you haven't figured it out, epoxy is expensive, okay? Really expensive. And so, I just did a 5-foot by 3-foot table that is over there behind us. You can't see it right now. It's got to get one more coat on it. And I use 6 gallons of epoxy in that particular one, okay? So as you can do the math, you can figure out that this stuff is expensive. So if you're working with deep pour, hopefully by now you understand there's really 2 types of resin. You've got deep pour, well there's more than 2, but 2 primarily ones that we're using for here. You have deep pour that you can pour anywhere from 2 to 4 inches depending on the epoxy manufacturer. And then you also, and I think some may make it bigger, but anyway, that's what I'm used to, 2 to 4 inches. Or you've got tabletop epoxy, which is used to go on the top after your project is complete if you choose to go that route. There's different mix ratios and they need to be handled differently. And the bubbles, how important they are to deal with as they come, vary a great deal between deep pour and tabletop. Let's talk about deep pour. If you're doing deep pour, I simply rarely ever worry about my bubbles. I mean, if I get a ton of them, of course I'm dealing with it. We tend to use the blowtorch here, or you can use a heat gun. Just be careful how close you get. You don't want to burn the epoxy. But I'll deal with it and I'll go across it. And after I've got the majority, of course, those bubbles are coming from 2 things. To some degree, mixing it, as well as, but a lot of it depends on how dense the wood is, how hard, how soft the wood is, how soft or how hard the wood is, and how much air is trapped in it that's going to come out. Those are the things that cause bubbles. And so, as you're getting your bubbles and you do your pour, you just want to go across it. On deep pour, I'll probably spend, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 minutes or something, coming back every 3 or 4 minutes and kind of going over it with the torch and get rid of them. After that, I simply don't worry about it, and here's why. No matter how small or how large my project's going to be, it's either once it's completed with the deep pour process, it's going to go back through my planer, or it's going to go on my slab mill. So either way, I'm going to be taking off some of that on top no matter what I do. And so that's when those bubbles, whatever's left after that, I'm not suggesting completely ignore it. Like I said, do it for a little while, but don't worry about it, because you're going to be taking that off when you run it through your planer or when you run it through your slab mill, making those bubbles irrelevant, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. My recommendation, and I can I can recommend that with complete confidence. You know, between my wife and I, we've got several hundred boards under our belt at this point. I started doing this October of last year and became obsessed with it. And I have made every single mistake a human being can make in this journey because I, like you, learned the vast majority of what I know from YouTube and then, of course, trial and error. And what happens to be missing a lot on YouTube and a lot of the YouTube videos are all the little things that can go wrong. On my channel, I'm going to be going through those and telling you about how I experience it, what I think causes it, and how to avoid them in the future. Okay, so now we've talked about deep pour. Now we tend to use, you know, a drill with a kind of, you know, a little whisk thing on the end of it to mix ours in buckets. When we're doing a lot at one time, you know, we may be doing 10 or 12 things at one time. So I'll do all those the same color as an example. So, you know, the drill in that situation along with the whisk at the end of it, there's nothing wrong with that. Just go ahead and use that. It's a great way to do it efficiently, especially if you're doing a lot. Now, when it comes to tabletop, here's where things change a lot, okay? If you're doing tabletop, do your mixing by hand. Do it by hand. Just as you're mixing with deep pour and mixing with tabletop, you want to make sure you're going around the sides of whatever container you're mixing in, along the bottom, fairly frequently as you're mixing through that process. You want to make sure you're doing that so you're getting off the sides because the density of either your part A or your part B are not the same. So therefore, one can stick to the sides more than others. So make sure that you do that, okay? So mix by hand. If you mix by hand, you are going to minimize the amount of air that gets in there because tabletop, you know, hardens very fast. You've only got an average of about 30 minutes work time, and that's about it. And depending on the temperature you're doing it in, you could be pushing at that. Whereas deep pour, you've got hours that you can still mess with it and do things, okay? So you want to make sure that you do it by hand, not with a drill, okay? That's number one recommendation there. Now, a lot of people will try to do a flood coat right away. I simply don't recommend it. And unless you've learned the wood species that you're working with. I use a variety of wood. You can see I've got a lot of wood behind me. I have a lot of exotic woods down there under my miter station. And then I've got a lot more slabs and things over there. So I deal with a variety of woods, and they all have different characteristics as far as how much air will escape them. And so, I strongly recommend that you start with a seal coat. Now, there's calculators out online that tell you how to calculate how much you mix at a time so you minimize the waste. My wife has this down to a T. And so you want to make sure you follow those. Now, typically, if you're doing a seal coat, you're doing half of what you're going to do for a flood coat. A flood coat is typically 1/8 of an inch thickness on top. A seal coat typically is 1/16 of an inch. So you want to go around that and do a seal coat, let that harden for 24 hours, come back, sand that down lightly with 220 or 240 grit sandpaper. You're only sanding it to give the next stage of epoxy something to stick and adhere to rather than a soft, slick surface, okay? So you sand that down and clean that off, all right? And then now you're ready. Now this is the stage, depending on where you're at with it, and you have to just get used to the experience with it. If you're not sure, I recommend doing 2 seal coats until you got a good eye for it and you can look and see whether you can go from 1 seal coat straight to a flood coat or whether you're going to need an additional seal coat, okay? So when you're doing that, then you're going to do the same process again, lightly sand, and then next you're ready for your flood coat. Now, when you're dealing with bubbles, both seal coats and flood coats, stay on top of it. I cannot emphasize this enough. Do not plan on needing to go anywhere for 30 minutes. Stay in your space 30 minutes minimum. So you're frequently going over it, not getting too close with your heat source or you will have problems, okay? and going across it, okay? I tend to go with, back and forth like this, a whole cycle, and then I'll go long ways, a whole cycle till I cover the board, and then again, back and forth like this, a whole cycle, each trip on each board, okay? And I may sit there and do nothing. If I'm doing a bunch of boards at one time, I'm pretty much, or I should say, my wife is pretty much doing it non-stop. And you just got to stay on top of it. Here's the good news. If it still doesn't work for you, just do another one, okay? You just hand it down and do another one, all right? And so so with my deep pour, I don't really worry about bubbles, really hardly at all. I deal with them initially to get the bulk of them out of the way. Like I said, my planer or my slab mill is going to take care of that. But with tabletop, a different story. Stay on top of it, okay? Stay on top of it. Whereas a deep pour, you can go and come back like every half hour or so and deal with it because, again, you've got hours to deal with that. But I don't tend to spend too much time. Most of your bubbles are going to come up within the first half hour or so on deep pour. Tabletop, you're going to start getting them right away, especially on that seal coat. The more seal coat you do, the less the less and less that's going to happen, okay? So hopefully that explains a few things about bubbles and how to really get the most out of that. So do me a favor, if you like the content I put out on this particular channel, this is at the beginning stages of this channel. I happen to have another YouTube channel that is unrelated to all of this that deals with home studio and home project recording. I'm a musician. I've been doing that for over 40 years. And so I have another fairly successful channel over there that has bought everything in this particular workshop and enabled me to be able to pursue this passion with the money that I make from that one, okay? So here, my journey is to help you learn as much as you can, to share every single mistake I've made along the way. And one last tip, make sure you mix properly. Follow the guidelines. As an example, this particular epoxy for the most part is 3 minutes. This one is 6 minutes, okay? Pay attention to the specifics of that particular brand of epoxy. And if anything, over mix, okay? But if you undermix, that's a whole different video for a whole nother day with a whole set of brand new problems, all right? So like I said before, subscribe to the channel. If you've got any comments or anything like that, put them down below. Let's talk about these things offline. And until next time, I hope every one of you have a great day. Bye-bye.